Okay, guys, let's start. Again, thank you very much for having the time to join our first virtual meeting of the Qlik Integration Group. So, and of course, a special thanks to Alexander and Miralem to donate their time to be here today and talk and speak to us. So I'm not going to spend too much time with slides, just a couple of them. So let's do this quick. So first of all, the agenda. Very quickly, I'm just going to show a couple of slides, explain the team, what we are going to do, what we have, and stuff like that. Then we will start with Miralem presentation around Picasso and Nebula. And then we will move to Alexander. And then when they finish, we will have a quick Q&A if you guys have any questions, any comments. So please just let us know and just fire up all those questions. We will have also someone looking to the chat channel. So if you want to post your question in the chat part, then we will basically forward that question to one of the speakers. So first of all, just the team. In my personal part, I just want to give a big thank you to Richard, Ryan, and Piers to allow this to happen, and to all their help and all their support to put through this meetup, and of course our speakers. But before we start with the meeting, I just want to have a brief note. So we just released in our Qlik Integration YouTube channel a small video that we had with Sparrows. So this was basically a small conversation around the Qlik engine and how we can actually create the hypercubes. So one of the things I would like to tell you is, if you are starting to try to build your extensions, your mashups, you are having some problems in terms of how to create those hypercubes, please go and see this video. Sparrows actually explains very well how we can do it. A small tool that we can use that will give us actually all the guidelines to start. And then at the end, we have a special look and feel of his amazing work with Gnar. So it's well worth it, the 20 minutes. So if you guys can just go to our YouTube channel and have a look to this video. So today, speakers, first of again, thank you very much for having the time to be here. So we will have Miralem Drek to talk about the Picasso and Nebula. And then we will have Alexander Thor to talk to us about Qlik Core and what's new, what is about to come, and perhaps some big news around Core. In that case, again, thank you very much for having the time. I hope everyone enjoys it. But before I give the channel and the words to Miralem, I just want to give a small reference. Don't forget, next week, our friends from Scotland, they will host another meetup. So please just register and see it. It's going to be very interesting. Jordan is going to be there. And our Eat, Sleep, Click, Repeat group, they are aiming to have a new meetup on the 4th of June. Also go to their meetup group and see the news. So without actually annoying you guys anymore, let me just give Miralem the word. So let me give you the rights to present. And again, thank you very much, guys. And I hope you all enjoy. And Miralem, it's all yours.
Hope you can hear me. It's the first time I'm using more of a pro mic, so I hope it works.
It's all good. It's all good.
Okay, good. Thank you. I was worried a bit there. This is my sort of intro little session about data visualization with Picasso and Nebula. So this is very much a beginner's guide to developing visualizations for the Qlik platform. If you haven't done that before, so this would be a fairly decent intro to that. If you have, it could also be a slightly a small way to improve some of the understanding around Picasso, how that works. And we'll then go ahead and show how we go from a basic Picasso chart to a Qlik extension using Nebula. And as with many of my presentations, there will be code. Don't freak out. It's just how things actually are being done. So just a quick about me. I work as a senior architect at Qlik. I work out of the Lund office, or actually not from the office nowadays, but I do live just a couple of 100 meters from the office. So I'm working from home now, as I think a lot of others are doing. I do have a Twitter handle. If you want, you can check that out. I don't tweet a lot. The only time I do tweet is when I have something regarding APIs and new libraries and new tools around the Qlik platform. So I've been at Qlik since about 2013, 12, 13, somewhere around there. And my focus has always been around building visualizations. So a lot of the things that you see in Sense have sort of been influenced by me. And then later on, I did create Picasso itself, and I'm also creator of Nebula. So I work a lot of the APIs and open source that Qlik provides. So without further ado, let's just jump into some of the code. Picasso, if you haven't heard about it, it's one of the tools we have internally that we use for building the native visualizations. So it's pretty straightforward to get started with it. We have a element here. I'm getting a bit, yeah, sorry. The way we create a chart is from the code you see on the left is output going into the right white box. So from the get-go, we start with an empty data definition. We do have an element where we want to render the chart itself. And then the primary input to Picasso are scales and components. So our first approach to this is to add some data. So Picasso itself doesn't really depend on anything that is Qlik related. You mentioned hypercubes here with Spiros, and we'll go into hypercubes later on. But as the primary input, you can actually just have a very basic two-dimensional array. In this case, we have one dimension called product, and we have a measure called sales, and we have only 3 rows of values. And it's just a simple 2D matrix. So from there, we then specify scales. So scales is a way for us to map a data source to a normalized output that we eventually are going to use to show the actual data. So here we create a scale called A, and we then specify where this data is going to come from that's going to be applied to this scale. And in this case, we just simply state that we want to use the field sales for this scale. And Picasso is then going to look at the values associated with sales and figure out that the values 17, 13, and 8 are numbers, and it's going to create a linear range going from 8 to 17. And then finally, we have components. So the components are the actual visual output that you get to see in the chart. Every component has a type. And in this case, we've specified that we want to have an axis. And every component also has their own specific requirements on what you need to give them in order for them to be rendered. So an axis here requires a scale only. And we went ahead and defined the scale A here as the input for it. So what's going to happen here is it's going to look at all the values coming from the sales measure and create a linear axis going from 8 to 17 down here, which isn't visible. But it then between those creates automatically the ticks it needs to represent this sort of range of data input. So we then can go ahead and do the similar thing with a discrete range. So we've added a second scale. We call it B here. Again, the name of the scales doesn't really matter. You can name it whatever you want. They're typically named X, Y, size, color, anything that you sort of normally use in a chart. It's also good to have sort of similar names and the purpose of them. So the difference between a discrete scale and a linear scale is this thing here in between. So you'll notice we have data and data down here. We have a field and field there, but between here we have extract. And the only difference here is that instead of having sort of a range of values, what we're interested for a discrete scale is to extract every value from every row. So we're interested in the exact data sources. And we do so by simply stating that we want to extract every single value that's in the data source. And then we also go ahead and specify that we want this scale to be a band scale. And this will eventually create a sort of a sectioned parts for the labels to fit along an axis. And then we do the same thing and add another component. Again, it's an axis here as well, but we simply specify that this is going to be the B scale. And you'll notice here a couple of things that using only these as visual components, one of them is docked to the left and the other is docked to the bottom without us actually specifying any of that. And the reasoning behind this is that there's quite a lot of automatic logic going on behind the scenes in here. So when we look at the scale for A here, we know that it's a linear scale. And linear scales typically go on sort of the vertical span. So we automatically take and dock the axis to the left. And we also reserve just enough space for the labels to actually fit. So you don't have to worry about the size of the font that you may want to use here or how the values are formatted and how long they are. They would automatically fit into this docking layout that Picasso automatically calculates for you. And the same thing with the scale on the bottom here. The vertical space is just enough for the fonts and sort of labels to fit in here comfortably. So the extraction logic here in Picasso is pretty important and sort of a fundamental part of how everything fits together. So I'm purposely using here a very simple data table on the left. Again, it's the same data sources we had before. And we're then going to go ahead and see what happens when we actually try to extract these values for Picasso to use. So when I'm using an extract and specify that I want to extract the field product here, the output from these is an array of objects. So here we have every item in the data, every row here, is represented using a value and a label. So every object has sort of this textual representation, which is the label, which typically comes from formatting, or it could be anything else. You might want to change the label for chicken or pizza here. And then we also have the actual raw data input, which is the value. Now, since the products here are just simple strings, they're actually the same. Both the value and label are exactly the same. And as you'll see later on, when you want to represent something visually, let's say a point, typically that point has attributes. It has a shape, it has a size, it has a color, it has maybe an opacity, it has a border, it has a color on that border, and so on, as well as the sort of coordinates of it, so X and Y and so on. So we want to be able to extract data from the data source in order to represent that visually. We can do so by providing properties in this extraction logic. So here we add a property called v, and we specify that we want to extract and associate the values sales into these items that are generated on the far right. So every product here has a property called v, and inside that you see the same object. So we have a value and the label, just we have before. So here we again take the raw value, raw data input as the value, and then we simply coerce the label to be a string of that representation. You can, however, override these. So we can specify that instead of having this regular label, we can override it by taking the input and transforming it with a slight money formatting here. So we add $1 and we add some numbers after it, and we get sort of these slightly different sort of number format as output. So when we look at sort of this very simple data input, if you were to then take this and provide it into your data model in Sense, import it, build everything you need to build, you get into Sense, you create a table, and visually, you'll see pretty much the same thing. You'll see rows and columns in the table, but behind the scenes, you'll see what we call a hypercube. So this is basically the simplest representation Qlik has of your data. And it's kind of, very, all the data is still there, but it's slightly differently structured. So we have dimensions in a different array separated into a meta information object. And we have the same thing with measures here. And then for each one of these values, we have a data pages matrix containing the textual representation and the numeric representation of every single value. On top of that, we also have something called QLM number. And this plays a very important role later on when we apply selections in Qlik's entire sort of data model and its association engine. So while the textual representation could be very different for the same value, depending on how your expression are, the LM number is always the same thing. It's something that uniquely identifies the dimensional value in your entire data model. So as we go back to the sort of extraction logic, you'll get the same thing. So as I provide and specify that I want to extract a field here, it doesn't matter that this data is coming from a simple table or a more advanced hypercube, we get the same output. So here we pick out the products, and we also choose to use value as the QLM number from these. And we do the same thing with the property for the measure here, attach the property S here. We used V before, but again, it can be named whatever you want. And again, you can override these by specifying a value and a label function. So in this case, we go ahead and in this callback function here, you'll get this entire cell as input. And you can then use that to, in this case, double the value. And then we do the same thing for the value and format that with a $sign before. And we'll basically get slightly different output. So going back to our Picasso chart, let's go ahead and actually see how this would look like for a visual component called point. So here again, we're using the same extraction logic. We specify a field, and then we add a property because we want to be able to represent and position these points along the y-axis as well. So we specify that we want a property called y and use sales for that. And then as I mentioned, every component has its unique requirements. The point component here has a settings property. And inside that, you can pretty much set anything that is affecting the visual output of this component. So I went ahead and specified here that the fill color should be a deep pink. The opacity is 0.7. And then the x coordinate here is a function. So when we have a function here as an input, this is going to be called for every point in your extracted data set. For all 3 values here, we're going to generate a random value from 0 to 1, which will then cause these points to be randomly distributed along X. And to show that, actually go back and go forward again, back and forward, and you see they're slightly at different positions every time. And then we had another constant for Y, which kind of positions the points roughly 20% from the top. So this whole coordinate system is sort of normalized, going from 0 to 1. So if we had X 0, it would be about here, and 1 would be on the far right. So what we really want to do here is add a third representation so that the points are positions where they're supposed to be, right? We want the point representing a chicken to be in its sort of in its column, and the other 2 to be there as well. So we can go ahead and represent that using an object. And what we're saying here basically is that for the X coordinate and position, we want to use the scale B that we defined earlier. And we want to transform the product values through that scale and output the coordinate as a normalized value from 0 to 1. And that's going to result in sort of chicken being in its position horizontally here, pizza in its, and table in its last value here. And then we go ahead and do the same thing with the Y value. So we use the scale Y here, and then we're going to tell it that we want to use the Y property of the extracted values. That's going to map back to the extracted values, and again, the normalized scale, and now position the points accordingly. Now, finally, we can go ahead and do some brushing here. So brush is a sort of old age concept within data visualization that has to do with how you sort of link interactions between different components. And what we want to use brushing for here is selections in engine. So the first thing we want to do is specify some form of trigger. And it's fairly empty here because you don't really need to do much to specify this. So we just went ahead and give it a context, a name. This could pretty much be anything. We call it selection here. You can call it highlight. You can call it random. You can call it whatever you want. As long as this thing and this matches, then you're all good. So that's for the triggering. So when we have trigger, anytime I click, it's going to sort of respond and make a selection towards engine. But I also want to see this visually. And that's what we have consume for here. So here I specify that whenever this brush is activated, I want to make sure that all the active points have a stroke width of 5 and a color of green. So when I click on one of these, it's actually green. And I can then deselect it and select another one or select multiple and so on. So that's kind of the fundamentals of Picasso. If you want, I urge you to visit the Picasso.js website. We have quite not a lot of documentation. We know we're lacking. As always, you can always add more documentation. But there are plenty of examples here and how you might get started with some very basic examples. As I mentioned, there are plenty of different components here. We have, for instance, one if you want to make different pie charts and donut charts. If you want to build area charts, stacking and whatnot. We have a legend here that you can use. There's quite a lot of labeling strategies and how you position text in different shapes and tons of examples. So one of those is so this point distribution here. We have others that you can play around with. So as I mentioned before, Picasso on its own doesn't require any sort of connection to Qlik, right? So you can go in here. This is an online environment available to anyone. I can actually copy this and go into incognito mode, and you can start playing around with these to see how this behaves. So we have a very similar setup here. this entire chart here that you see with sort of labels, axes, grid lines, different coloring, size, and so on, that sort of all of it is pretty much defined right here. So we have a few scales, just as we saw before. And then we have two components here. We have a grid line that's using for the line in the background. And now we have some modification for the point component. So if you want to fiddle around with this, you can just go ahead and, for instance, specify. You'll notice here for the Y scale, for instance, we have grid lines going on here. You can change that. So if you want, you can specify X and M, like so, and you'll see so the grid lines go vertically instead. And you can change other things on the point component here. If you want, you can do a star, go up, and you see how those behave. So there are plenty of examples here. I have here a list of these, so you can click on any one of those and sort of try to explore and fiddle around, see how everything fits together. We also do have a Picasso Studio, which is made by one of the maintainers of Picasso as well. So this thing isn't an official Qlik product, but it's also great to play around with this. Here we have a pie chart, and you can sort of modify this thing in a similar way. So I can change this to inner radius here, 0.4. I can add some maybe corner radius of 10 or maybe 20 or 50, and you'll basically see how this kind of behaves. So don't be afraid to sort of just try this out. Again, you don't need to fiddle around with Qlik to begin with. To begin with this, you don't need any accounts, any authentication, any servers to set up. Just go to the link and just start playing around with it and see how it behaves. Now, as I mentioned, this is sort of just the input, simple, raw, two-dimensional data arrays. If you want to know a bit more about hypercubes and how they look like, I have a Qix Faker library, which you can find on my GitHub account. And this sort of allows you to create hypercubes and explore how this extraction logic behaves for Picasso. So I went ahead here and defined a hypercube using using one dimension. And I have an attribute dimension, and I have a measure. And this entire hypercube would look exactly like we saw before. So we have a matrix, we have some LM numbers and data values in here. And we have attribute dimensions, which is also a concept in hypercubes, which have a color here. Now, you don't necessarily need to use Picasso to render visualizations. If you want to use D3 or height charts or anything else, you're certainly free to do so. I will, however, mention that you can use Picasso's extraction logic without actually rendering with Picasso. So the way to do that is by accessing the Cube plugin in Picasso and providing the hypercube as data. And then we can just go ahead and do the same thing as we did before. So we specify here that we want to extract a dimension, and out comes the values for the 3 rows of values that we have. Now you can go ahead and specify the attribute dimension here as well. So if you want to extract the colors, attribute them info. Let's see if I can get this right. What this actually does is go through this entire hypercube, traverses down to the attribute dimension info, which is located inside every dimension as an attribute dimension, as key values, as objects. So basically, this is where the value is. So that's the second value. The first value is kind of positioned in the same place. Here we have tan value. And basically, you just get these 3 values as output. So this is a great way to sort of explore how the extraction logic works. And sort of attribute expressions and dimensions is something you would typically use in a Qlik extensions as attributes on sort of the visual aspect. So we use it to color the background and sort of values and rows of a table, and use it for tons of different things. So again, that's fully supported in Picasso. You can use that as well. So that's sort of all with Picasso. And once you've explored all of this and actually want to get into making this extension, how do you actually build a visualization that works with Qlik and that has a connection to Qlik? So for that, we also have another library called Nebula.js. So this is something that we've been working on for a while that sort of has a more modern approach towards web development. And what this contains is a ton of things. It's not just one library. It's actually, it's completely empty, Nebula.js itself. However, it's more of a project name of a collection of things. So inside this project, we have command line interfaces that sort of helps you get started building things. We have visualizations like bar chart and pie chart and so on that you can use in a more modular way. And we have APIs for web integrations and building custom visualizations. So I'm going to go ahead and see how that sort of behaves using my command line interface. So I'm in here and I want to go ahead and use the command npx. So if you're not familiar with this, this is something that comes along with Node and npm, which basically allows you to run an executable without actually installing anything first. So here we have the Nebula.js CLI. So this is on npm and it's also open source, so you can check that if you want to. But what we want to do is start with a project. And I'm going to call it a, I don't know, my, let's say pick me, first Picasso extension. So if I were to hit enter here, let's do this. It's going to try to install the sort of basic stuff first that it needs for Nebula to work. And hopefully it's then going to ask me, what do I want to use? So from the get-go, you can choose to use Picasso if you want to. If you prefer other libraries, you can do so as well. In that case, you would go ahead and just simply choose the none template to not use Picasso at all. In our case, we're going to choose minimal here. We also have other templates. If you have a template for a bar chart, for instance, you want to start with that and go off of that. But I'm going to use minimal here, and I've actually already created it because once you choose this, it's going to start installing a bunch of things, including things for testing, things for sort of building for Sense, which is going to take a lot of time. So I'm going to cancel that, and instead I'm just going to open up the actual result of this creation process. So in here, it sort of created an entire structure for me. We have a source folder, which contains all the source code. This also includes some of the logic that's needed for interacting with the engine and providing layouts and sort of when you mount stuff and update stuff and so on. And there's a lot of extra stuff in here, which we're not going to focus on today because I just want to go looking at how you actually go from a Picasso and use an extension. So I have my, in all these files, I have this sort of Picasso definition where I'm supposed to place it. So again, you'll see we have the same configuration as we had before. We need scales and components. So I'm actually not going to do anything from the start here. I might actually just, I can just pick this thing, which I've already modified. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. Like so, and I'm going to go back in here and just paste this in, and I'm going to save this. However, for the year here, I want to go back to using the actual hypercube values. So I'm going back, I'm going to use the first dimension here, regardless of what that is. And for the measure here, which apparently is sales, I'm going to use the measure info, like so. And I'm basically just going to do a yarn start here. And what this is going to do is boot up a local development server running on my machine, which is sort of going to allow me to begin with my journey to sort of connecting things to Qlik. But the first thing you see when you boot this up is actually sort of instructions on how you connect to different deployments. So we have here examples of how you would do it for Qlik Core and QCS and Enterprise and Desktop and so on. It also remembers previous connections. So I have a previous connection here, which is my own custom QCS tenant. So I'm actually going to click on that, and it's going to reroute me to actually log in here. So it's been a while since I logged in. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So once logged in, it's going to reroute me back to my local machine and show me all the apps that I have on QCS. So from here, I can select an app and into the development server I get. So here is the chart itself. It's already kind of a chart. It's pretty much what we modified before. And I'm going to see if I can actually put these side by side so we see what's happening here. Okay, close this. So as we're making changes here in our code locally, anytime we make a change, it's going to run on the fly. It's going to update, build, and refresh automatically for us. So you might notice here that this legend kind of is in the background, and I want to change this so that it's actually docked to the left, outside and beyond the pie chart. Once I save that, it's going to refresh, and now it's kind of docked to the left. I can go ahead and modify other things. Change the corner radius so it's not so extreme here. And I want the inner radius to be maybe a bit more, like so. Oh, damn it. And I might just want to increase the stroke width here. All right, so far, oh, that looks blurry. So far, so good. Now, when we sort of interacting with this, nothing's actually happening here. So what I want to do is go ahead and actually add the brush logic that I mentioned before. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that into here. So I'm going to begin by specifying that I want to, whenever I click on one of these little sausage thingies, I actually want to trigger a brush in one of the contexts called selection. And for the consumer, I kind of want to go ahead and do the same thing here. So I want to tell it that whenever this context is affected, I want to modify the style of every sausage that is inactive to have an opacity that is slightly lower. So let's say 0.4. So let me save that. And let's see if this works. Yay. So as I'm selecting here, notice that it pops up a little selection toolbar here. And you'll notice that the current selection toolbars are actually responsive here. So I click, click, click. I can do a confirm selection. And I can also go ahead and select from these and see my little sausage chart up to date. So You'll notice here we have a couple of slightly different buttons out here, which is sort of outside of the chart itself. And this is mostly sort of the whole entire dev server is sort of targeted towards developers. So if you want to play around with some of the hardcode properties in here, you can open this up and modify the entire property thingy. So if you want to understand these things, I guess I could go ahead and recommend Spiro's session. He'll probably go into depth on what all of this means. You can go ahead and collapse these and see sort of how all of this behaves and what it kind of looks like underneath the hood for the backend. We also have a couple of properties here, components that are kind of tied to those properties. So we can go ahead and add this, add a title here and say I want to show titles. And now when we're selecting these things, this actual selection toolbar pops up inside the actual chart. All right, so we're still outside of Sense, right? This is not an extension, it's an actual, it's just a chart that can consume the engine anywhere you are. If you're working with core or desktop or building your own mashups, you can just plug this in and that would work there. But what we're after is to actually get this into Sense. So the first thing we want to do is run the build command, which comes along with this template here. And this is going to build my chart first as a sort of agnostic visualization, which might take a bit of time. And then I'm going to go ahead and run the actual command to build it for Sense. So this isn't part of the template, which is why I'm going down into sort of the node modules directory, but we'll eventually add this in so it's easier to sort of integrate this with Sense. So when I build this thing, it actually spits out 2 additional files here. PicMeText, which is the traditional format for representing extensions in Sense, and then sort of the entry point to that file, which basically just pulls in another file from the build to distributary. So what I'm going to need here is when I look at these 2 files, and in particular this one, it sort of pulls in the distribution folder here. So what I want to go ahead is zip this thing into a folder or into an archive. So this thing, this is just a local shell command on Mac. If you're running on Windows, you can go ahead and open up a Explorer, if I remember correctly, and just zip those 2 together. So what I'll get here is a zip file containing my extension. So I'm going to head open up the folder here, and there's my zip extension. And what I want to go do now is go to my tenant here, where I have the console and where you sort of modify and upload your extensions to your own tenant. So if you're running on QMC and Enterprise, you can do this to the QMC. It's the classical sort of upload extension thingy somewhere in the mess of settings and properties and menus in QMC as well. So here I want to go ahead and drop my extension, and I'm going to go ahead and add that. All right, so that's been added in there. Now let me go to the actual app. We can pick an app here. It might take a bit of time. And let's create another sheet here. I'll go into edit and we'll look at, where is it? Oh, it's right here. So we're going to pull that in. Might take a while to load. Yada, yada, and here we are. The classical extension thingy. So we have some requirements here. We need at least 1 dimension. So I'm going to go ahead and add a dimension and add a measure. And there's our sausage. So as we go out here, it's fully interactive again, just like any other extension. The selection toolbar here is integrated with Sense, so it kind of works slightly differently. Yeah, that's kind of it. You get some of the menus here. If you want to modify and add more menus in here and more components, then you can do that through some of the APIs that we have in Nebula as well. So going back to the presentation, I'm running over time here. The next step for you, if you want to explore more, again, I suggest you explore Picasso first. It's the easiest way to sort of start building visualizations and charts. And if you want to try out Nebula, you can go to the open source repository. And from there, you can find your way to the actual hosted documentation. So this is a temporary link. We're going to change this eventually when we find a different place to host the documentation on. Once you're in here, you can sort of follow along with how you would do this to embed visualizations. So for instance, how you would do setting up a Qlik Cloud Services account, and then how you would connect, and you can go ahead and create mashups from the template as well. Configure that, and you can then go ahead and visualize data for embedding that. I have some documentation here. We're still working on the documentation for Nebula. That's sort of an ongoing thing. If you want, you can read more about the Hypercube introduction and how that all fits together. We have some different concepts here in when you're how you select data. I will also say that Nebula and Picasso by itself are two completely different things. So if you want to use React or Ember or Svelte to build tables and other components with Nebula, you can do so. If you want to use D3 straight out, that works well as too. And the same thing with Picasso, you don't necessarily need to use Qlik as input. You can play around with it anywhere and use it with other products. If you want to, I don't know how Tableau's structure looks like, but I'm assuming you can use it there as well. That's been it. Try ahead and get involved at the open source that Qlik provides. We need you guys. We need input. So anytime you're interacting with us, gives us a lot of feedback. Is extremely valuable for us. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Miralem. It was actually really, really cool. And at the end, it's actually really nice to learn all the stuff that you guys are doing open source that can actually be used besides Qlik Sense for other stuff. And yeah, really cool, actually. Thank you very much. So guys, also before we jump into Alexander as well, just to let you guys know as well, if you, for some reason, you came a little bit late and you want to know if we are going to share this presentation, yes, it will be available. So then you can follow again, if you miss anything, you can follow again all what Miralem basically shared with us. So yeah, again, Miralem, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
No, our pleasure. So in this case, let me just send presentations. And yeah, Alexander, is all yours. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks. So it's always fun to sort of go after Miralem. So I just have a boring PowerPoint, so I'll stick to that. I actually won't show a lot of code today. Instead, I want to talk a little bit more of what we have shipped over the last couple of 6 months from Qlik. So not specifically for core, but across all of our product lines, and a little bit of what's actually to come. What we tend to see is that we ship a lot of software at Qlik, and we don't really tell a lot of people of what we're shipping. So a lot of the really interesting features is usually shipped maybe 6 or 9 months ago, and now people are sort of starting to find them. So I want to cover a few of those, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's coming next. And then finally, I'll do a little feature pitch, something we're thinking about, but it's not in any type of planning stage, but would probably be kind of cool to look at. So my name is Alexander Thor. I'm part of the product management team at Qlik. I do tweet, and it's very important tweets, I would say. Just the other day here, I retweeted Martin Mahler when he said it was Wednesday. You know, if you want to follow me for content that doesn't matter, you know, I'm your go-to guy. At Qlik, I work mostly sort of with APIs on the client side. So anything, you know, extensions, mashups, Nebula, Picasso, all of those type of things, that's usually sort of within my domain. So we want to talk a little bit about like what's new, right? What have we actually shipped over the last 6 to 9 months? We've actually shipped quite a bit. A lot of stuff has happened in our QCS or SaaS solution. We shipped the fact that you can actually upload extensions and themes, which weren't possible. I think we shipped that in November. We're actually added in API key authentication so that you can authenticate using API keys. There's also additional authentication layers here. We keep adding more and more different public APIs. So everything from the REST API to engine, audits, reloads, collections, spaces, and so on and so forth. So the SaaS solution that we have is evolving, right, all the time, and it's evolving very, very rapidly. So what I'm telling you here now is going to be outdated in 2 weeks, and something else has been added. A new endpoint to manage a specific area of the solution has been added, and so on and so forth. So it's a tremendous sort of speed of development going on right now on the SaaS platform. Something I did want to cover, sort of my first little did you know thing. The REST API for Qlik and for the engine, it's actually available in all of our different products. Available in Windows, it's available on Kubernetes, it's available in the cloud, and so on and so forth. And there's actually a lot of really cool stuff in here, which I don't think a lot of people have started to look at yet. I would say maybe Rob Wunderlich is the first one. But so if you go in, you can find this from the normal help.qlik.com. You'll find a Qlik engine REST API. These type of stuff has been around for quite a while, that you can do a little health check thing, like, hey, how are you doing, little engine? But now we're actually adding a lot more stuff here. So we're actually adding to the REST API things that are interesting, things like that you can post apps, you can delete apps. But the really cool stuff is that we're actually adding in metadata and lineage endpoints. So by just issuing an HTTP command against the engine now, you can start fetching metadata and lineage about your app. You don't have to start digging into some weird WebSocket stuff. You don't have to write a lot of bespoke code. You can use any type of Postman if you want to try this out. So if you click on, for example, the metadata endpoint, you can start getting a lot of really interesting stuff coming back. So like, how big is my app in bytes? What type of tables exist in my app? Which type of fields exist in my app? What's the actual reload metadata time? Like, how many cycles did I spend in the last reload, and so on and so forth. So what can you do with this type of stuff? You can, of course, build very interesting sort of monitoring solutions on top of your deployment. Just being able to scan all your different apps to sort of see, just do an inventory of what type of tables, what type of fields do I have in all my apps that are currently in production. Then you can combine that with lineage. You can start actually grabbing lineage information from your apps. All of this stuff was previously available, but you had to write a lot of code to get to this. So now we actually made it a lot easier to actually find this information. And this is lineage in terms of where does the data connection go, how is it used, and then you can combine that with the metadata to actually get a pretty good view of the metadata around your app and how you can use that. So that was kind of my first little tidbit of did you know kind of stuff. We've added a lot more, especially the engine has seen a lot of features. I saw that Sparrows was on the call. He's been a driving factor behind a lot of this stuff. We pushed the tree data API into stable. This is a data representation that you might not be super used to within Qlik. Normally, you're used to seeing sort of a straight representation of data, where you might have a pivot representation of data or a stacked. Now we're also allowing you to do a tree data, to do more hierarchical or tree structures. The benefit here is that you can build pretty interesting solutions. If you think about being able to do custom tooltips or visualizations within visualizations, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of really interesting use cases here. We added a bunch of new methods. So all of what I'm showing you here is actually available now as of April 2020. We added a method called save as. This, I think, will be a game changer in general how we work with Qlik Sense applications. So in Qlik Sense, we had a concept around what we called session applications. So that was an application that only existed in the session. There wasn't a corresponding application on disk, so there was never a QVF involved. So we used this for quite a while for certain things like doing data prep and other stuff. What we always lacked was the ability to take that session application and then save it. So now I actually added that. So now you could start building solutions like you're prototyping some data load scripting or you're prototyping a data model. And at some point, you can go, okay, this is actually information or analysis that I'm interested in, and start hitting save as. And then it will take that session application and save it down onto disk. We've added in export reduce data. Loop and reduce. Have fun. You asked for it, we gave you. We've added in expanded expressions. So in the past, it was quite annoying. I might think this might have been from Count Nascool, which I saw on the call as well. The ability to sort of take a set analysis expression and then just expand that. So if you had variables and things like that, it would expand the variables out so you would get the string. Quite useful. A new method to get set analysis. So it would actually look at all of the different selections that were made in your application, and then it would construct a set analysis statement based on that. So if you're building sort of, you're building maybe a tool for your users because they don't really like to write set analysis, you could write, for example, maybe a little Chrome extension or something that will go in and look at all of the different selections that are made and construct a set analysis statement for you, and then you can use that in your expressions or somewhere else. And that is actually also built into the measure dialog inside of Sense. We've added trend lines. Ooh, I think that was back in November, could have been in February. And of course, trend lines landed inside of our visualizations in the actual client, but that also means there's a corresponding structure underneath inside of Qlik. So now when you're building a hypercube or you're building an extension, you can now opt in if you want to have trend line support. So we can automatically just give you trend lines based on a measure and so on and so forth. So all of these different structures is what you can find inside of the documentation. I'll purposely go kind of quick through this, and I'll leave a little bit of time in the end for questions. If you are interested, and I know we keep talking about this, and I keep showing this website, nobody ever goes here, but I want to show it anyway. If you are interested in what's actually coming in our products, the API Insights page is really good. That means you can go into, for example, Qlik Sense. You can click on API changes. You can maybe pick an API. I don't know, something like, where is it? There, script language API. So the script language within Qlik. You can take maybe say a baseline from June 2019 up till the recent release. And you can see that we've added a couple of methods. We actually added in 4 new statements in the February release, which I don't think anybody knows about, but you can now do conditional coalesces. There's more statistical functions in terms of doing fractals over ranges, but also for aggregations, so on and so forth. So I highly recommend that you go in here for every new release and kind of just get the feel for what's actually new, because we do add a lot of stuff that perhaps don't always make it into the release notes, especially this type of stuff. But this is really useful. Even if you're not a programmer, if you're just writing Qlik script or Qlik expressions, the scripting language is actually an API from Qlik's point of view. So you can also go in here and find those type of stuff. You go to time, I think. So I wanted to talk about, that's something we shipped. I want to talk about what we're going to ship specifically now in June. I wanted to find a cool quote from Back to the Future that would oh, this is something I didn't, so I just wrote something. So this was what Miralem showed you guys. So Nebula is something that we will ship in June. We will then bump the project to 1.0 and call it officially supported. So this is a library that will be officially supported by Qlik. It will be the de facto standard moving forward to build extensions, but also to build mashups. So it's not going to be there from, it will not have a one-to-one replacement of every functionality from in June, but we're working towards that goal. So it should, as Miralem mentioned, Nebula contains a few different parts: the ability to create extensions or visualizations, the ability to embed visualizations, and then a bunch of different CLI tools. We bunched that into Serve here. So that will help you create and build content. So moving forward, taking something like Nebula, and then you combine that with something like Enigma, allows you to build very powerful web applications. So you can sort of take the visualizations that has been created in Nebula and then consume those within your web applications if you want to build a mashup or if you're just embedding into a third-party system. What this also means is that from a Qlik point of view, we're actually in the process of rewriting all of our visualizations to Nebula. We have now taken most of our visualizations and broken them out of the Qlik Sense codebase so that our visualizations will have no dependency on Qlik Sense per se. They will be their own kind of standalone packages. We're also taking those visualizations, and when we feel confident, we are then putting them on GitHub and open sourcing them. But we're also distributing them onto NPM, so that all of our different visualizations will now be available. We've had multiple requests over the years where people ask to extend a visualization, or if I could just see your code, I could tweak it a little bit. We now made that available. So if you would go to GitHub on the OSS page, you can actually search for SN-, and you'll start finding all of our different visualizations. So right now there's 3 that are open source. There's more that's going to ship in June. I'll show you a list in just a second. And if you're interested in how we build visualizations in Qlik, if you wanted to look at the macro chart or maybe the org chart, this is the actual code that gets delivered when you hit the installer of Qlik Sense. Well, it's the compiled code, but if you wanted to actually, go and tweak it, you can clone this repo, you can fire it up in Nebula, and you can start playing around with that specific visualization. So this has a lot of really cool implications. So when you think about mashups in the past, mashups was you pull down this massive JavaScript file from the Qlik Sense server, and then you rendered a mashup, and it was kind of slow. And then the business users wanted to update their Qlik Sense installation because they got all of these new cool features inside of Qlik Sense. But now all of a sudden your mashup might break for some weird reason. So you have this very tight dependency between your web applications and your BI platform. The benefit moving forward is the fact that we're now breaking that dependency. So you can actually build web applications that are connected to your BI platform, but they're not it's not a hard dependency in between them. So when you upgrade your BI platform, that doesn't mean that the visualizations in your web stack automatically update anymore. So you can pick and choose. The biggest benefit here is that, let's say there's a bug. No, we don't have bugs, but let's say we have a bug in the bar chart. In the past, if you wanted to fix for that bar chart, you actually had to go and download a new version of Qlik Sense, run that through in production, retest your apps for your BI stack, and so on and so forth. Moving forward, if you wanted to use that bar chart in a web project, you can just go npm install bar chart. You don't actually have to touch your BI stack anymore. So it's a very nice way of separating these two concepts. So these are the visualizations that, actually a few more, I say I missed a couple, but the bar and the line and the pie and the Sankey, the funnel, the org, the Mecco, the buttons. I think Miralem, correct me if I'm wrong, we're also shipping the bullet and the KPI. Maybe not KPI in June, but tentatively.
Sure.
So these,
probably.
yeah, probably.
Can't make any promises, but it's kind of I think we just published it actually on the Nebula scope and NPM.
Oh, awesome.
So probably going to appear soon somewhere.
Yeah. So all of these visualizations will be available. As you saw on GitHub, not all of them are open sourced yet, but they're published on NPM. As we feel more confident, we will start making them more and more open source. There's certain things in the visualizations today that we aren't really proud of, so we're trying to fix that prior to us open sourcing them. What we're working on next and this is then post-June, would be things like the straight table, the scatter plot, the combo, and the KPI I think is actually done. And then, of course, we have a few more visualizations. By hopefully, mid Q3 this year, we are about 40% done. And we've tried to sort of pinpoint the most important visualizations to start with. So perhaps not the box plot or a few of the others, even though I think the box plot is pretty easy to convert. There's, we hope to have a fairly good coverage in terms of visualizations. And then, after we shipped 1.0, we have to ship 1.1. And at this point, we're actually still in the planning stages. So we have ideas, but what we're lacking right now is feedback from the community and from our partners or from our customers. So, your feedback is critical. So if you have feedback, just go on GitHub and register a feature request onto Nebula, and it will be heard. And it's what we take for input when we craft roadmaps for our products. Things that we are considering is something that's dear to my heart, and that's server-side rendering or static rendering or snapshots. So the ability to take a data structure, send that onto an API, and just get an image back. This is actually built into the, let's pick a quick one here. So this is the Meko chart. We actually have some server-side rendering. We're just waiting on sort of finalizing the API here. But if you click, for example, export to image, I get an image back. And this is an actual PNG that I can start playing around with. In the past, this would have required things that you talk to a server somewhere, you had to be authenticated as a user, and so on and so forth. This opens up a lot of really interesting use cases where maybe you want to build a service where a user can click on a visualization and send, send to Slack. And it will take that data that's in that visualization, send it over to some endpoint that you built, and then pipe it on to Slack, for example. No licenses required. You are able to build very interesting solution here. Maybe you want to automate something. You want to send an email every Monday. So you loop over a dimensional value and pipe away that the output of that visualization to a distribution list or doing something else. I actually saw trying to keep off the chat here. I'm coming back to Jonas. I haven't forgot about you. Is this actually supported? Yes. It will be covered under sort of the QlikSense support agreement. That's our attention. So it's not, I'm hesitant to say just open source. It will be open source and it will be supported. What that means is that you can still look at our code, but if you, for example, would take the open source version of a visualization that Qlik ships, you would take down that source code, change it, and then upload that source code to sort of as an extension into Qlik, and it won't work. Now, granted, you can't call support anymore because you took open source software and you changed it on your own, and you broke it. So if you break it, you buy it, kind of thing. Are you not on Core? Yes, you can do this without Core. This is QlikSense in every shape and form, if it's on Windows or if it's on Kubernetes or if it's in the cloud. So this will be sort of the way forward. Oh, Jesus. There we go. We also want to add a little bit more in terms of object lifecycle management and more CLI improvements. We really want to have more and more feedback here. So if you have, go on GitHub and submit them. So what I said this will replace the extension API and capabilities API. And yes, that is our ambition. Our statement of direction is that the extension API and the existing capabilities API will get deprecated. That means that Nebula is the future, that will be the future replacement of the capabilities API and the extension API. We're not there yet. We will have to reach somewhere between 80 to 90% in terms of visualization completeness. So before we can issue a deprecation notice. So we're very confident in the API. that's going to reach 1.0. We're super happy with the API. Now we just need to make all of the different visualization types available for Nebula. So once we're closer to 80 to 90% of all the visualizations converted, that's when we can issue a deprecation notice for the extension API and the capabilities API. So, new feature development is being done on the Nebula track. What you see is what you get currently on the extension API and capabilities. We are not adding new stuff there. I don't have an ETA for deprecation today. I will say that the deprecation period will be long. It will be between 12 to 18 months. So let's assume we deprecate Christmas this year, which is a very aggressive timeline. Probably won't happen. That means, capabilities API will stay supported for another 18 months. After that, you still have product support for an additional 2 years. So if you want to play around with the capabilities API, you can do so until 2025. You're going to be happy with that. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. But the feature development is being done on the Nebula track. Just to kind of get your minds at ease.
If I could just interject here. So the thing that I just demoed with the little sausage chart that I did, then uploaded to an extension. So all of that was developed using the new APIs. But once you've made it into an extension and uploaded to QCS or Enterprise or wherever, you can then use the capability APIs to render that in your mashups. So there's nothing saying here that you can need to choose one of them exclusively. You can sort of hop on the train wagon for the new stuff, but still use the old stuff for for as long as you need to, pretty much.
Yep. So I'll kind of leave it at that in terms of Nebula. I'm seeing we're running out of time here, but we're actually shipping a new developer portal in June as well. So a new place to kind of go to get information for any type of developers, anything from tutorials to API reference to find libraries and tools. This will be very, point and focus for developers. So hopefully this will make it a little bit easier, both to get started, but also for seasoned professionals to find additional information. I'm just going to skip through this very quickly. We're also shipping a CLI. This is primarily for QCS to begin with. So our SaaS solution. So to automate things inside of SaaS. Over time, our Qlik CLI will evolve into also covering the Windows platform and the Kubernetes platform. So if you've used things like core control in the past to automate things, this will sort of supersede core control over time. And the first release will come in June. We're also actually getting API access to the Qlik Insight bot. So in June, this is still a little bit tentative. We think we're going to be able to make the cutoff. This might slip, I should say, to later this year, to September. We're really, semi-confident we're going to hit June. But the fact that you will get API access to the Qlik Insight bot. So if you wanted to, incorporate NLP type of stuff into your extension, you will be able to do that moving forward. So you can sort of jack into the natural language processing that we have at Qlik when you build your software or your extension or your mashups. So that will also be coming. API access to alerting, a question in the chat, that will come a little bit later this year. That will not ship in June. I saw that it was funny that Jonas had a question earlier because I wanted to do a little bit of a feature pitch. I suck at naming things, so I just call it function extensions. So name to be decided. But what we're seeing sort of evolving right now is that we're seeing people building visual extensions that aren't actually visual. They're building visual or extensions that you drop it onto a sheet. It doesn't have any visual type of data representation. It just does things in the background, or maybe it's a button or it's something else. These shouldn't probably be extensions, and that's probably because we at Qlik haven't given you enough tools to extend other parts of the software. So idea so far. We're not even in planning stage on this, or not even at design. So take it for what it is. I just wanted to kind of pitch this and see if this makes sense to you guys. The ability to kind of build extension that targets certain areas of the Qlik Sense client. Things like maybe a context menu of a visualization, or things like the application menu, where you wanted to perhaps inject your own type of action and then fire off some code corresponding to that. Well, why not being able to sort of extend the existing bar that we have up here? Maybe you wanted to embed a mashup here, so you build a mashup for executive reporting, just a couple of KPIs or dumbed down for your executives. Put that as a tab or something along those lines. So I know that Jonas had a question on, can we extend things like your normal visualizations? When we make them open source, of course, you can always clone them and you can make changes and upload them as an extension. Downside is you're going to end up with 2 pivot tables in your deployment, which isn't really nice. So perhaps we should look into, can we give you some type of action? Because most of the times what we're seeing is, and I think you mentioned that in your comment as well, it would be nice if I could right-click a visualization and add a comment, for example, or do something else. So essentially what you just want to be able to grab is the context of that visualization and do something with that information somewhere else. So along those lines is things we're thinking about. I just have to bug Miralem enough so he builds it. But so if you think things like these are interesting, let us know. This is stuff that's on the roadmap. I didn't actually have much more, and I see I'm 1 minute over, so that's probably a good thing. I've seen there's a bunch of different questions coming in here. I don't know how you want to deal with that. If you want to pass them over to us, if I should read off or.
We actually, guys, you've been tracking Richard Pierce. Actually, to be honest, Miralem already replied to some of them in the chat. You also mentioned some of them. So to be honest, I don't think we actually miss any of the questions.
I don't think either, unless someone listening has got a question that's not been answered.
Yes, so I did get a question here from I saw from Thomas. Similar, so they're developing sort of a night mode extension, but currently they have to add it to every sheet to make it work correctly. First of all, use a theme, don't use an extension. I'm not sure if you use a theme or not, but yes. But this is the typical stuff that I want to be able to solve. In Qlik View, if anybody remembers that, we called it document extensions. Similar to document extensions, what you could do with them is something that I would like to be able to do on Qlik Sense as well. So yeah.
Okay. Guys, is there any other questions that you guys might have?
So young in the picture that you guys showed. Well, I was 25 and now I'm old.
No questions, guys? No.
People are still typing up, but I should say, we presented a lot of new stuff here, and especially around Nebula. I do want to say that don't freak out. Things are going to change, but they're going to change very slowly. If you're scared about climate change is faster than the pace of deprecation. Don't be too scared. Things will change, but they will change gradually over time. So take it slow.
Okay, guys. Miralem, Alexander, thank you very much for your time. It was really cool, both presentations. Thank you very much. And of course, I want to thank you also, everyone, for joining. And don't forget, next week we will have already one hosted by our Scottish friends. And yeah, we will give more information very soon about this recording. And of course, for our next meetup. Guys, thank you very much for joining. Have a nice day, and most importantly, based on this time, stay safe. Take care, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.